Hello, I'm Ham Clark, and welcome to the Leadership Impact Program for the Academy of International School Heads. Today I'm here with Joe Stucker, who was a head of school for a great many years, and Joe has put together our course on financial resources and how best to shepherd those financial resources as you are a head of school. So Joe, thanks for taking the time with us.
My pleasure.
And we're going to get to some of your thoughts on that particular issue, the course that you're doing. But first, some more general questions for you. Heads of school are, of course, charged with all kinds of responsibilities for the school community. You're asked to lead, motivate, inspire, ensure the growth and development of hundreds of students. But one responsibility, of course, is to always model the way, always set the example for others. So my question, Joe, is how did you walk the talk at your schools as a school leader?
Well, I think it was always important to me as a teacher to be informed about what was going on, which didn't happen all the time, to make sure that we weren't getting mixed messages from higher ups. And I felt it was always important for me to be honest with people, whether it was the students I taught or the parents and so forth. So that's been something I think that was instilled by my parents over a period of time, and that just kind of carried on as I became a teacher and as an administrator. That it was important to be honest to people. It was important to say the same thing to people at different times and not different messages. You get mixed messages, you really can confuse people. I feel it's important as a head of school, as a principal of a school, to inform people about what Jim Collins calls brutal facts. Often we hide those under the table. That's the elephant in the room in many cases. Without addressing those, you basically don't go anywhere, and oftentimes it just exacerbates the climate in schools. I prefer to deliver the difficult messages in person, whether it's a one-to-one personnel issue or whether it's a significant issue that's impacting faculty. I prefer to stand in front of them and tell them why and have them ask the tough questions, some of which I can answer and others I can't. I'll get back to you, I do. We've had some chances over time, particularly with taxes in virtually every school, that is a pocketbook issue. And I think one of the biggest issues for faculty are those that deal with the purse. And so you really need to spend time and energy communicating clearly and honestly to people. And I think that process has resulted in most cases with people buying into what I have to say and entrusting me. And that spills out into the rest of what we've done over time.
Sure. As you think about, Joe, this notion of being direct, being honest, being clear with the community, how about just kind of helping others to feel empowered, taking a shared role in leadership? I mean, one of the things that I feel strongly about is that the more we can get the community to appreciate the issues and kind of come at something together, solve a problem together, the more likely we can have people on the same page going forward.
I think that's really important, and I think my style over time has been to talk with an administrative team. We say we have the particular problem, what are some of the options? And then sit down with faculty or the board, or if it's the parents, with some thought being given to, hey, here's the issue, let's talk about that issue, and begin to look at some input on how we may process, move forward, but not necessarily on whether we should. I think that is an administrative responsibility to make that decision. We really need to address, for instance, the tax issue. Boards were behind that. So how are we going to do that? We engaged a small team of tax experts who spoke Chinese, knew the tax approach, and then we would meet periodically with the community and said, hey, we are looking to fully tax compliant. There will be a financial impact on that. We don't know exactly what it will be, but it's important for the school to be in tax compliant. Parents agreed with that. We talked with the faculty from time to time about what that would mean. That often changed because the tax information changed.
The rules change sometimes?
Absolutely. Or in one case, there weren't any rules.
Okay.
And so what are we going to do? And the board stepped up and said, we'll pay this for you until such time as we know what's going on. And so Those are the types of things that have helped us, me, the different schools get through the difficult times, often around tax and sometimes about budgeting in general.
Okay, great. So Joe, at the Academy for International School Heads, we talk a lot about the importance of encouraging the heart. Could you share a story about how at one of your schools you've worked to bring empathy and compassion into the school? And I know you're focused on the resources and the finances, but there's got to be lots of components to a successful school.
There's a couple of things that come to mind. Much earlier on in my career as a secondary school principal in New Hampshire, I probably wasn't particularly empathetic as it came to teachers who were not effective, in my opinion, in the classroom. And when I talked to them, I probably wasn't as polite as I could have been, and frankly, as I should have been. And ended up making it more a matter about them as bad people, which wasn't the case. I learned over time that a better approach is to talk about the fit. You know, you're doing a good job. Often that was the case, not always. But this is not the right fit for you. We're moving in this direction. You don't seem to be interested in that direction. We've talked about that before on a number of times. You will recall that in some of the evaluations that we've had. And you're not happy here, and it's not working for us, and so let's talk about the fit. And I found over time, both in the US and overseas, that was a much better approach, a softer approach. Because in most cases, people would admit, you know, you're right. This isn't the best school for me. This isn't the best fit. The other one that comes to mind is that I was at a school where we were about to change the medical insurance. And overseas medical insurance is something that's extremely important to the international community, that it covers not only where they're currently living, but traveling. And we were getting a better financial deal by going with this other company. But one of the teachers, who happened to be a local teacher in this school, was having some medical issues, and it turned out that she needed a kidney transplant. And the company to which we were almost ready to sign on said, we won't cover that. And so we got a hold of our existing company, and they said, we'll cover that. And I said, I'm not making the change. It would have been financially better for the school, but it would have been a terrible decision. Not only for that woman who had spent many years there, but what signal does that kind of decision make? So, or send to the rest of the community? So those are a couple things.
So trying to focus on what's best for the community and the interests of the people in the community.
You know, and a lot of times there are certain faculty who say, you know, what are you going to do for me? And my approach has been, well, first of all, we're looking at what's best for kids. And if we can work in what you're asking into our structure or whatever, then fine. If we can't, I'm sorry. And there were times when we could, and there were times when we couldn't. And here again, where I felt it was really important to be transparent to faculty, that this is why we make this decision, and this is when we don't make this decision. And it's worked most of the time. Most of the faculty have bought into those kinds of things.
Great, great. Thank you. So next, Joe, I want to transition our conversation to talk about your specific area of expertise and financial resources. As you started to work on this online course and develop this, and hopefully a lot of our viewers will get into that course, but as you started to work on that topic, was there a learning moment or a story that came to mind, something that said, oh, I wish I'd thought more carefully about it, or I wish the school community had approached the situation differently? So what comes to mind?
Well, there have been a few.
I'm sure.
I would say that starting in New Hampshire, which when I was a principal, building budgets was all paper and pencil. There were no such things as computers. And we also had, in New Hampshire, being in a small town, we had to take our budget before the entire population. And everybody could come out, and then literally we'd have 500 or 600 people in the gym. Many of them were retirees who came to New Hampshire because they had no tax at that point and were not looking to see a tax increase, which generally school budgets led to. And 5 out of those 6 years, we walked out of that gym without a budget. And we had to go back, and we had to cut, and then they would reconvene the meeting and get it passed. That process, I believe, helped me figure out the budgeting process overseas, which for most cases has been a breeze compared to the public school environment. But I guess there are a couple of cases that come to mind. I went to a second school, and after 6 weeks being there, I was looking over the budget and saw that there was quite a discrepancy between the number of faculty and the number of students. The students have been declining by over a couple of hundred students, yet the faculty remained the same. And that school had a limited reserve. And if they had continued moving in that direction, there's a pretty good chance that reserve would have been wiped out. So I went to the treasurer. We met periodically before finance committee meetings and so forth, and said, here's an observation. And he looked at me. This guy was a CFO of a major international company posted in the United States. And he said, I didn't realize that. And I'm saying, no, wait a minute, I don't have an MBA. I just have, been a high school principal kind of stuff. And I said, we have a real issue here. So it ended up that we needed to cut 16 faculty by the end of the year for the coming year. There was no reduction in force. There were no board policies. There was zero. So the first thing that I did was, after meeting with the administrative team, and we kind of sketched out of the way forward, was to hold a faculty meeting. Most faculty don't have a clue about budgeting or finance, and when you say those terms, they kind of, oh my God, this is high finance and investment. So we developed a presentation that showed them, here's the capital budget, this is what it does. Here's the operating budget, and here's the funding pieces. Now here's a long-term, maybe a 4 or 5 year snapshot of the school's financial status. And I said, there's one thing to keep in mind. Black numbers are good, red numbers are bad. And up on the screen, probably 75% of the numbers were red. And there was dead silence. The purpose of that was not only to provide them with some information, but to develop a level of credibility that we weren't making this thing up.
Right.
This is a real crisis.
So being transparent and being direct, as you suggested initially.
It's important in these circumstances, okay? So buying pencils and papers and books is such a small fraction of the operating budget. In many of our international schools, the largest piece of our operating budget are salary and benefits, mostly administrative and overseas teacher salary and benefits. So when you have to cut $1 million out of the budget, you're not going to get it by cutting pencils or paper and things along that line. So we said to the faculty that we're going to go back and figure out some way forward because we don't have a plan. And so we developed some criteria. For instance, are there teachers who want to leave or planning on leaving anyway? Are there people who are willing to volunteer to leave? Are there people who are certified in more than one subject so they could maybe teach 2 different things? And we had a whole list down the line. Shared it with faculty. And they gave us some ideas, and well, what about this and what about that? We held faculty meetings on a pretty regular basis to keep them posted on what was happening. Simultaneously, we had the introduction of a tax for foreigners for the first time. There was no understanding from the tax office on how that was going to be implemented. Teachers felt the board knew that, but never said anything to them. So they were upset with the board. Their perception was wrong. Wasn't correct, but nonetheless, that was their perception.
Sure.
So we're talking about letting 16 people go. We have this new tax, and oh, by the way, 6 miles that way, we had an active volcano. That eventually blew, which created some emergency procedures that we had to put in place, and all this stuff was going on at the same time. So we shared our reduction in force plan with the board, showed them what we needed to do, why we needed to do this, and at the end of the day, we cut 16 positions. Now, we also had a tight timeline because we wanted to let people know whether they had a job or not in time to register for the recruiting fairs. Yep. And back then, I talked to the ISS and Search and said, here's the deal, and they were cooperative. They said, if you can't let us know by a deadline, we'll fit these people in if you say they're good teachers, kind of thing. So they were flexible and willing to pick up some last-minute stragglers if that were the case. But when you consider, and it went smoothly.
Good.
And when you consider how badly something like that could have gone, I think the fact that we talked to faculty, we solicited input, we explained the situation, we showed the reasons why we needed to do this, the transparency, the clear communication.
Getting out in front.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think with most things, and the one thing I always say to everyone at my school is no surprise.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And if
yeah.
you can
Yeah.
let people know what's coming and help them invest in decisions, solutions, then that's
I mean, faculty appreciate that.
Sure.
I appreciate that as a teacher, and
Yeah.
that always didn't happen. And when we had all those tax issues in China, I mean, there were 5 different taxes. It had a financial impact. People were gaining a lot on unused housing or unused travel allowance, and all that should have been taxed. And so we had to make the changes. And again, I think the process was such that we heard very little pushback, and faculty had chances to ask questions. We took those down. We tried to get answers. We shared those answers. It was, again, just a repeat of stuff over and over, and it worked.
Joe, a number of people will take your course and learn more about your approach, but how about just sharing a few of your general principles about how you would approach the budgeting process, how you would kind of create a system to make sure that the longevity is protected from whatever could happen in the current market situation?
Well, there's 2 or 3 things. You have the board and the finance committee and the role that they play, and then you have the administration and the role that they play working with faculty. We would actually start the process at a board retreat shortly after school opened, where we would
building it for the next year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Building on, we came out of the retreat every year that we had it with a projected enrollment at that point in time, with a projected budget process was pretty much the same year on year, unless we learned something, we had to make some adjustments. And then with the first finance committee meeting, we would talk about what are some of the parameters for developing the budget. What's the inflation rate likely to be in China? What's the inflation rate likely to be in the U.S., where we bought a lot of materials? And what are a few of the other parameters? We had an idea what the salary was, because we had a lockstep a step salary, and we knew the increments between. We had an idea what those would cost, so we could budget that kind of thing. So these form the preliminary parameters for developing a budget. The finance committee would report to the board and say, here are the initial parameters, here's the initial timeline. Questions? My view is that every single board member needs to understand some of this stuff, not just the finance committee.
Right.
So we would begin to march forward. The other critical point is the timing of the salary and benefit contract decisions with recruiting. Recruiting now starts in September, whereas when I first started, it was a heck of a lot later, right? Ideally, you would want to get those salary and benefits done so we could say to faculty, next year you're going to earn X, Y, and Z. The worst case scenario was you're not going to earn any less than what we're getting. And also to get out some changes in contract, which we had to make for tax reasons and so on and so forth. So I had a diagram that showed this is how we're going to do this. This is the timeline. I would present it to the finance committee. Questions, comments, okay, this is what we're going to do. Inform the board about that. In the meantime, the administration, the principals, and other cost center heads are developing the budget. We had a template that went online. Stuff would be dumped into the master budget. And we also talked a lot about the importance of how we were going to make reductions if we had to do that. I didn't want a principal to arbitrarily cut somebody's budget. So there was always a process. If we had to cut X thousands of dollars, then tell me what your process is and how this is going to work.
Right.
At the end of the day, we have to set priorities. And our top priority was safety and security and maintaining existing programs. After that, well, we have to make some decisions. But there is a process, and informing people about that process. And that worked quite well. What I found in a couple of schools was that the whole budget process overwhelmed the board. And so I introduced the idea of a special board meeting that would inform the board of all of the budget. We had been doing it along the way, but it would be a comprehensive review. Here's what the recommendation from the finance committee is. Here's why. Here's the impact. Here are some proposed recommendations that we want you to vote on at the next meeting, which was a couple of weeks from now. there would be a lot
So a
of
little time to think about it, prepare.
absolutely, because what happens is if you show all this stuff, and this is what happened, they showed all this stuff in the first meeting and said, we want you to vote on this. Some people were just overwhelmed.
Right, right. And new trustees never even seen any of this. And,
So that worked very, very well in a couple of schools. So in China, the finance committee and the board members were really, really sharp. They came from some top companies, and they were great. I learned so much from them. But they didn't need 2 meetings.
Okay.
I did that a couple of times. I said, why are we doing this? I said, are you comfortable with 1 meeting? They said, absolutely.
Okay.
So boom, we'd get it out of the way. And then there's the process of informing people what happened. And that means going back to the cost center heads and saying, here's your budget for next year.
Yep.
You've already known if there's reductions or not. And then a letter written by the board chair to the community. These are our goals. This is what we're, as a consequence, this is what's going to happen the following year, kind of thing.
So any really difficult problems related to budget from any school you were in that is worth sharing with our audience
Well,
today?
yeah. The second school I went to had not raised tuition in 8 years. This is the same school that had a declining enrollment.
Okay.
Now, it's absolute bad practice, folks, not to raise tuition at least a small amount. I think ISM talks about a 2 or 3%, whatever inflation is. But to go zero year after year after year, when you have an escalating salary scale and cost of living was going up in this particular city.
Plus inflation, yeah.
Plus inflation, plus exchange rates were going wacky. They were losing money. That's another reason, being overstaffed, but also that aspect of it. So we had a great treasurer who worked for IMF, working with financial issues with his country, so this was a piece of cake for him. And we held this meeting and shared with the faculty, he shared with the parents in Spanish the whole budget scene and said at the end of the day, something the board had approved, we're going to increase tuition 23% in 1 year, and then this next year we're going to increase it 8%.
I think I'm glad I wasn't at that meeting. Right.
Well, I want to tell you, it went well.
Really?
Because parents had never received an increase or asked to pay anything different in 8 years. And I had parents come up to me afterwards and say, this is the first time that anybody has ever explained
shared
the budget to us.
Yep.
And it went well. But you don't want to be in that position.
No, you sure don't. No, I think great lesson in terms of communicating and keeping this as a relatively open process and making sure parents understand the school's financial picture.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, when we had all these tax issues in China, we had a tremendous number of closed session meetings because the board had to talk confidentially about what are we going to do here? What are the financial implications? What are the strategies that we may employ? That really isn't information that we wanted out. What we did talk to parents twice a year at the semi-annual meeting of parents was, hey, we have an issue. Here's the issue. This is what we need to do. We're going to have to pay the tax. We're going to have to change the legal structure of the school so that we know what the ownership is, and we'll keep you informed.
And we'll report back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of folks there. We moved our general meetings from the cafeteria to a very nice hotel with the compliments of the general manager. We got a lot better turnout for lunch. And a lot more people showed up, and a lot more folks were informed, and I think that helped along the way with the understanding of where we were going and what would have to happen. So
Joe, if you were going to give a 2 or 3 minute speech to heads of school about the importance of budgeting and the specific concerns about budgeting that you have for them, the best advice you have for them, what would you say?
Well, I would say start early in the school year, and well, you may think that August is early, but if administrative team, particularly if there's a new head, particularly if there are new members around that team, you need time to make sure everybody's on the same page and understand what that process is going to be over time. Number two, what data do you need to make a decision? And one of that is the salary and benefits. What's the process for comparing your current salary and benefits with, say, whatever your neighbors may be? What are your benchmark standard schools that you're comparing yourself with? How do you get that data? When do you get that data? Is it accurate data? Because sometimes this self-reported salary and benefit stuff is not very good.
Right.
So what are you going to do about that? There's some contract language that needs to be changed because you know you're moving in a different direction on again, taxes. And what does that language have to be? You want to run that by your lawyer. You need to make sure you inform the board. So those are the kinds of things that take time. And if you rush those and drop the ball on those, you end up, in my opinion, probably being in trouble. And importantly, whether it's the budget or anything else, focus and not spray. For 6 out of the 7 years, we had the same basic goals. And we drilled down, we didn't expand, because there's a finite amount that we can do as an organization. A finite amount, in my opinion, what we can ask teachers. And a lot of the recruiting that I've done, teachers would complain that every single year they would go to a school and now it's this theme, and next year it's that theme, and the following year it's that theme, and we never get ownership of these kinds of things. That's another example of focusing on what's really important. Budgeting for professional development is really important. Sometimes boards don't understand that.
Right.
So inform them about that. Inform them about the challenges of recruiting today, which is a lot earlier. Not all boards understand that. Most of them have never recruited teachers. So if you can keep them in the loop, tell them what your issues are, tell them how they can help you, I found that it's helped a lot.
So Joe, the demands of the job of head of school are extraordinary, and it doesn't take long to realize that you can't make everyone happy in this role, clearly. In your time as a head, how did you move from what are people going to think to I'm enough, I'm doing the best I can? And how did that transformation happen?
Well, I get back to communicating what's important. These are the things we're focusing on and why. It wasn't, what do you think we ought to do today? I don't deal with that approach. Maybe there are folks, but I prefer to have an admin team come together and say, we think this is important, this is why we think this is important, let's go talk to the faculty about it. And if we get a lot of pushback, we'll rethink. If it's a few folks, okay, fair enough, but can you live with this? One of the things we used to say is, if you were in the decision-making chair, you may not make this decision, but can you live with this decision that we're making? Mm-hmm. I'd say that to the board, say that to the admin team sometimes. And I think that understanding that our primary focus is on students, that doesn't mean that faculty get a short shaft, but that if push comes to shove, we're going to be looking at what's best for students in most cases, and if we can accommodate it, some faculty, broadly speaking, faculty requests, we can consider that, but there's no guarantee. And again, I think being upfront and talking to faculty about these things has helped. Sure, there are folks on the edges, by and large, who complain about it, and it's the way it is, frankly.
You can't escape that.
No.
So, Joe, you have been in the international school world quite a while, and I'm just interested in your wisdom. As you think about the role of a head today, what's the biggest challenge? What's the thing that heads should really be most focused on, and what advice would you give for prospective
the
heads?
international school scene has changed dramatically. It's no longer the nonprofit for foreigners. It is the for-profit for local residents. You know, in China, there's thousands of schools coming online that are predominantly for Chinese students. But they offer the IB, for instance, so they're looking at some of the same kinds of teachers. They're paying rather large tuition charges as opposed to the private school in China, or let alone the public school. Sometimes you'll have foreigners go to those schools, particularly with young kids who want to get their kids, at those ages, something to learn about Chinese language and so forth. So it's realizing that the nonprofit schools are no longer the majority of schools in our business. That it's an increasing challenge to find high quality faculty.
Yep.
Therefore, you need to be in a position to not only attract and retain, and it's more than just salary. It's the working conditions. It's the environment in the school. You know, our faculty involved? Are they getting professional development? Do they feel that they're growing? All those things are really important to retain your core folks, whether it's an administrator, your secretary, or whatever the case may be. So those things have to be addressed in a timely and ongoing fashion. I think also today, given the world economy, schools need to be concerned about a sudden economic crash.
Sure.
And the
Because
impact.
we never know what's around the
Well,
corner.
particularly with what's happening now, you know, trade barriers or, you know, realignment of countries or whatever the case may be, you could wake up and find that you've lost a significant number of your population because of some world incident, somebody tweets something or whatever the case may be, and now what are you going to do? Do you have a plan? Do you actually have an emergency plan that covers X number of students on a short-term basis because they're pulled out overnight? The embassy says, whoosh, and out they go. Or the corporations, whoosh, they're risk adverse, out they go. Now what are you going to do? You got contracts with faculty. Can you cover those contracts? So that's something that I think every school should be thinking about now.
Yeah. So plan ahead.
Absolutely.
Be prepared.
Absolutely.
No, that's great advice. All right, last question for you, Joe. What is it that in your days as a head of school kept you up at night? What was the thing that was most on your mind in terms of providing anxiety?
Well, in most of the schools, except for one, it was recruiting, because in a lot of the schools, the salary and benefits weren't all that great. And so the pool of people who might be interested to come to a truly third world country is smaller. The one school, we didn't lose people for financial reasons. We paid well and good benefit package. Housing was pretty good. We lost it because of air quality, a couple things like that. There's nothing you can do with that, so I didn't get too worried about that. But if we're losing people because of things we're doing, then you better step up to the plate. Sure. Case in point, we had a couple of teachers in one school who were pretty ugly to kids. And we had some of our faculty saying, we're going to leave because we don't want that teacher, and that happened to be the only teacher in that grade. But beyond that, we were working with that teacher. And it finally came to my desk, and I said to this guy, listen, you know, we've talked about this. I know you've talked to the principal, and it doesn't seem like you're very happy here. Yeah, you know, the kids aren't what they used to be. And I said, you're absolutely right, Danny, they aren't. Would you like to leave? He says, can I? I said, yes. Well, let's work it out. We shook hands on it. We worked it out. And so we were able to get somebody in there. We kept most of those faculty. And for the good. And so, you know, those are the kinds of things you got to making sure that you're not, as a school, chewing up your own folks and driving them out the door.
Sure, sure.
You know, I worried about land. I worried about taxes in the last place. And I worried a little bit about the fact that the board chair and I were leaving at the same time. And that can be the worst time. And fortunately, we had a transition plan for the head of school.